Hey everyone, welcome back. It's now my pleasure to talk to Edred Whittingham. He's a student at Exeter University studying politics, philosophy and economics. Thanks for joining us today, Edred.
No problem, Matthew.
And maybe you could start with explaining your general journey to Extinction Rebellion and activism in general.
So I could start that story in many places, but I suppose I would look first to when I was about 9 years old. So I first learned about climate change when I was 8 or 9, first became aware of this term called global warming, and as a 9-year-old it was very difficult for me to process emotionally. You know, it's something that I would cry about, it's something that I'd feel very distressed about, but as I went into my teenage years, it became something that I pushed to the back of my mind, and I didn't really think about it for a few years. Then in 2018, I kind of had a resurgence in interest, and that was prompted by at least two things. So first of all, the publication of a very hard-hitting academic journal, a paper in a hard-hitting academic journal. The paper is called Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene, but it was commonly reported in the media as the Hothouse Earth paper. So this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And what it said is that if the planet warms by just 2 degrees, then the effect could be a tipping cascade. Basically, we could set off a chain reaction of warming effects that could lead to the whole Earth system finding a new sort of state, a new resting state, in a place which is 5 or 6 degrees hotter than the system that we have today. Now these are just numbers, but to put it in perspective, the Paris Agreement, which is this big agreement ratified by all nations of the world, seeks to keep the Earth from warming to less than 2 degrees, because if you think about the amount of energy that's needed to raise the entire Earth system by 1 degree or 2 degrees, it's a very dangerous thing. And so reading about that paper kind of reawoke me a little bit. It made me realise, oh yes, climate change, this is a thing still, isn't it? Sort of forgot about that. The second thing was I heard about Extinction Rebellion. So they launched in October of 2018. I first read about them in November of that year. That was when they did a big action in London where they blocked 5 bridges. And I thought, thank God there's an activist movement that's taking this seriously. And so a few months later I got round to joining. This was just before the April Rebellion. I was in London in April 2019 just for a couple of days, and yeah, it just took off from there, and I've now decided this is the issue that I want to give my life's work to, really.
Okay, fantastic. So can I ask a bit more about your family background and perhaps your friendship group as well? How did your family and friends react to you getting involved in this movement?
It depends. I mean, some of my old friends don't really know much about it. I sort of keep that as a separate thing in my life. My family are broadly supportive, so to the extent that, you know, I got myself arrested in September of last year, and my mum and dad were a little bit nervous about that. You know, what will that do to your future prospects and so on. But otherwise, they've been very supportive. I think, broadly speaking, they understand the urgency of the situation that we're in, and so they see my involvement in the group as a positive thing. And I have a few close activist friends as well, which I know mainly from the university.
Great, fantastic. So is there I'm not that aware of Extinction Rebellion, or I wasn't until recently. Extinction Rebellion, Exeter University group. How active have you been, and how long has that group really been going?
Well, COVID-19 has slightly buggered us because there's a huge amount within any activist movement of being in the physical presence of people. That's a big part of, you know, forming long-lasting relationships.
Of course, yeah.
You just don't get that over Zoom. Add to that the fact that you can't really do big actions in a pandemic, and this has resulted in us not being very active for a while. But we did, when we were active, so between about September 2019 to the start of the pandemic in March, we did some good actions. I mean, we supported the student strikers here, obviously, sometimes stewarded at the marches. a group of us went down to see Greta when she came to Bristol. So we were at the front of the march with Greta marching through Bristol. That was an exhilarating experience, although I have to say I felt very sorry for Greta after that. You know, just the intensity of that public exposure must be difficult to deal with. But as an independent group, we mainly did comparatively low-level actions, so like die-ins in the Forum, which is the big building on campus, to raise awareness of the fact that the university still was taking money from Shell and such things, and calling them to get rid of that. But yeah. So a few. I would say we did a few low-grade actions as a group. You know, we're very new. It's an open question as to whether, when things open up, we become a more active group again.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, you mentioned the Paris Agreement, and obviously we know you're studying philosophy, politics, and economics. I'm very critical, as are lots of people in Extinction Rebellion, as you probably know, of the Paris Agreement and of the IPCC, because it's purported to be scientific, always what they publish, but what many people don't realise is, yes, it's based on science, but the way it's spun and presented to the public in kind of shortened, slightly spun documents it's always kind of in favour of economic growth and business as usual to an extent. So I wonder if you have any perspective on the IPCC and the Paris Agreement that you'd like to share.
It would be profoundly hubristic of me to say that I know better than the IPCC, or I know better than the professors at Exeter Uni, many of which have written for the IPCC. But I have heard it claimed by many reputable speakers, including a gentleman called Peter Wadhams at the University of Cambridge, the world's leading Arctic scientist, that the IPCC is very conservative, that it doesn't take into account things like tipping points and feedback loops and all these sorts of things which are a real risk that we should take seriously, but we can't say with absolute certainty that that they will take place. So and another thinker that comes to mind, another scientist that comes to mind, is Kevin Anderson of Manchester University. He again reflected this view that the IPCC is quite a conservative organisation. I mean, given my limited scientific understanding, conservativeness in science is a good thing, because the scientific method is all about what's the term I'm looking for? It's all about eliminating uncertainty. So you come up with a hypothesis, you test it against the evidence, and if something disproves that, then you graciously let that hypothesis go. So it is important that a body like the IPCC, which exists in order to synthesize all this science, looks at what we can say for sure. So in many ways, the conservative nature of the IPCC is a good thing, but the problem is, as you say, you don't necessarily get the more alarming possibilities, which should be taken seriously. And secondly, as you say, it's still very much locked into the economic growth paradigm, and that's true also of the Committee on Climate Change here in the UK. So Kevin Anderson, the Manchester University scientist, he said in a wonderful talk to Extinction Rebellion Waltham Forest, I believe, that he'll have chats with these scientists over a beer, and they'll say, "Oh, there's no way that we're staying below 2 degrees of global warming." But as soon as a government minister or some sort of civil servant figure comes into the room, they immediately put on this sort of government hat, and they begin to put a spin on things. Oh, we can have green growth. So it's true. I mean, everyone should read the IPCC's work, but they should keep in mind, this is not, you're not necessarily seeing the whole picture here.
Yeah, great. Well, that was a very balanced response. Thanks. Taking that a bit further, I mean, have you got any more to add about your general perspective on capitalism, or at least neoliberalism, that kind of form of capitalism that we have? Debt-based economics, globalization, financialization, all those sort of trends that we're seeing in modern capitalism. Have you got anything to say about how that's driving ecocide as well as the climate crisis, and what can we do about it? And do you identify as kind of socialist or anarchist or something in between? Or sorry, that was a
interesting panoply of questions. Yes, no, it's one. So. Gosh, how long have we got? starting at neoliberalism, I think that anyone who's got two eyes to see can say that we need to leave that system behind, and that's for many, many reasons. I mean, if you take a sort of quite narrow and in-depth look, you could talk about how it hasn't produced the society of entrepreneurs and innovators that it claimed it would. It crashed the world economy. Even Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve, I believe, famously testified in Congress that there is a flaw in the neoliberal system. And before this he was a sort of a raving advocate of this doctrine. But the reason why it hasn't been replaced is that left-wing thinkers haven't been able to present a clear alternative that we could all get behind.
Yeah.
So, in other words, once the old economic story failed, the old neoliberal story failed, we weren't able to present a new story, and so neoliberalism has kind of been kept on life support ever since, with quantitative easing and bank bailouts and so on. So neoliberalism is clear cut. We need to get rid of it. For capitalism, for a long time, I was kind of on the fence on this issue, in the sense that I've certainly benefited, from capitalism. My dad has worked many traditional capitalist jobs, like he's been on the board of directors for technology startup companies, and currently he works for a venture capital fund at the University of Birmingham. So, and I enjoyed a very high standard of living growing up as the result of that. But at the same time, I've always had this slight unease at the kind of bubble that I grew up in the sense that it's very, very normal in our system to walk past homeless people on the street, or to endorse peculiar ideas like that I need to stand out in a crowded job market. What a terrible idea if you think about that. I hope that everyone makes it, on one level, but it certainly, whether it's capitalism, whether it's neoliberalism, whether it's something else, it does pursue us towards this very kind of hyper-individualised outlook on life that I think shuts us down from other people. Right, so in regard to ecocide, capitalism depends upon growth, that's very clear. And as has been said by many, many speakers from all across the political spectrum, eternal growth on a finite planet is not possible.
Yeah.
So if capitalism depends upon eternal growth, we need to find an alternative to capitalism. I would even venture to say that's not an ideological statement, that's just a recognition of the physical, ecological limitations of the planet that we live in. So in regards to what we replace it with, and you asked me how do I identify, I'm definitely a socialist, in the sense that I believe that workers have a right to a share of what they produce, and as the old saying goes, if you work in the mills, you should own the mills. I certainly empathise with anarchist principles as well. So I've heard many people, including Noam Chomsky, talk about what anarchism really means. So it's not bomb-throwing mayhem, it's more the idea that authority should have to prove its legitimacy, and it's us as citizens to ask people in authority, on what basis are you exercising this authority? I wouldn't necessarily call myself an anarchist, if not yet, just because I think that there is a lot of order that we enjoy from having a state, which we shouldn't be contemptuous of. But I'm happy to go there.
Okay, great. I could have a long conversation with you about that, but that's maybe for another time.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah. Okay, so now, when you contacted me on Facebook, what was really interesting is that you talked about your potential future journey now, that once you've graduated, you don't know whether to go into a conventional career or job, or at least put that on hold at least temporarily, and go full on into activism, and kind of live a very more transient lifestyle, I guess, couch surfing and so on, and being a full-time activist. So could you explain a bit more about that dilemma, and have you fully decided one way or the other, or?
Haven't fully decided. I mean, there's a lot of ifs, and there's a lot of ifs and buts. A big if for me is, so I'll phrase that in a different way. A big uncertainty for me is just how bad is the situation vis-a-vis climate change. So if it is true that we've got that we can just gradually reduce our emissions and still avoid the worst case scenario. I might be more inclined to go down the more politics route, try and get into local government, try and get into national government if that's an option that's open to me, because I've heard many climate scientists and other people, economists, say that what we need is a change in politics. We need to change the system. So you can spend all your life reading scientific papers, but unless any of that's actually put into political action, then nothing's going to change. We're going to stay on the pathway that we're on. But if it is true, so that's one option, is try and change things from within. What I struggle with is this idea that we may already be too late, or we may only have 10 years to sort it out, which is what the famous IPCC 2018 report claimed, is that we need to cut our global emissions in half by 2030. And as we said, that may be a conservative estimate. If that's true, we need all boots on the ground. We need to be putting relentless pressure on government, on business, on all these actors, and we need to be waking up the public. And I do wonder if being an activist is a better use of my time in that respect. Would I be wasting, if I went through my first pathway, would I be wasting years of my life trying to make a professional difference when I would have been better, blocking a road in central London, basically.
Sure.
Yeah,
fantastic. How? I've got this view, unfortunately, that perhaps it's going to take a series of quite serious disasters before enough people wake up to put pressure on our so-called leaders to make the right changes, by which time it might be slightly too late. What's your view on, let me rephrase it slightly. Could you speak to how bad things could get, or are likely to get, if we don't act to a certain level within the next few years? What are you scared of? What do you think could happen?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing to say is that I'm not at all a qualified person to talk about this. You could spend your life studying this stuff and still not be quite sure what to make of it. But what I have are kind of bits and pieces that I've heard here and there. I haven't sort of connected all the dots. But if I understand correctly, there is a risk that, well, the first thing is that we face a global food security crisis. So, we are heavily dependent in the UK, for instance, on food imports. Much of our food comes from areas which are sensitive to climate shocks. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but the point is it's an alarming statistic anyway. My hero is a journalist called George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian, and he's currently writing a book on the global food security crisis and what we can do about it. And he did a wonderful talk with the University of Oxford, Hertford College, I believe, where he basically laid out the situation much more eloquently than I could now. But I would encourage anyone who's watching this, to look up, "Can we feed the world without devouring the planet?" That's the name of the talk. Can we feed the world without devouring the planet? But he paints a very, very scary picture of what we look like. And one of the things he says is, we all know what will happen if there's limited food supply. The rich will mop it up, which nations will mop it up, which people within those nations will mop it up, and the rest of the world will be left to go hang. And he compares this, we've seen the spectacle in the pandemic of people fighting over toilet paper, but you don't want to see people fighting over food. That could be very, very ugly. So that's one thing that troubles me, is this risk that we face of a food security crisis. The other thing is the issue of mass migration. Now, I need to be careful how I say this, because I don't have anything against people coming to the country for whatever reason. There's a very dark and xenophobic road that you can go down. But what I mean is, depending on how much the planet warms, large swathes of the planet, home to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, could become largely uninhabitable. Due to the effects of it being just too hot to work outside, or too hot to produce food, or freshwater supplies run out, increased rates of tropical diseases, moving further north as the planet warms, and estimates vary. There's a widely reported but disputed figure by the UN, which is that there could be 200 million climate change refugees by 2050. To put that figure in perspective, if it's anything like that, if it's even 10% of that, the Syrian migrant crisis, which destabilised European politics and pushed the political spectrum to the right in many ways, was triggered by about 1 million, between 1 and 4 million refugees.
Okay.
Again, I'm a little uncertain on the facts here, but to answer your question, so those are the two things that scare me. There's a very real risk that we could just run out of food. We cannot produce enough food to feed 8, 9, or 10 billion people. And the other thing is, as millions of climate change refugees try and make their way away from the tropics and into the global north, it could turn very ugly, very violent, very quickly. I mean, people have talked about their nightmares of, their children being drafted to go and use machine guns on migrants trying to enter Europe, for example. So George Monbiot as well has talked about his nightmare of refugees trying to escape from a grey desert and being beaten back by security guards. So those, broadly speaking, are the two things that I'm most concerned about.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a really great and vivid answer as well. And something I'd just like to note as well is it's not that unlikely that many people in this country could become climate refugees, because the way we organise, the way we use our land at the moment, we're not self-sufficient in food. So if we don't get our act together, then it's going to be us knocking on the doors of other countries. So, okay, well, so you obviously have something of an understanding of geopolitics, because I didn't know, I haven't asked you yet whether your course, I understand you study politics, but I don't know how much of that is theoretical and how much of that is about the contemporary geopolitical or recent geopolitical situation. So, I mean, do you know much about geopolitics in general on a global level? And if so, have you got any comment on any of the roles of the major sort of players like America and Russia and China and the European Union as a whole, as regards particularly, as regards the climate crisis and the ecological crisis? I mean, it's something I'm recently thinking about more, is the trajectory of China, and especially sort of in tension with America, and is America's heyday coming to an end, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a massive area, but
it's a huge and complex topic.
Yeah, like perhaps there might be something that you've thought about recently, today or yesterday, something that's relevant to this, me bringing this up. I don't know.
It's difficult to say. I mean, it is a huge and complex topic. I mean, I like to think that I'm clued up on geopolitical issues, but then, you read something like even just The Economist magazine, for instance, and you realise just how ignorant you really are, in the sense that, as I say, it's one of those things you could spend your life studying geopolitics and still only know a fraction of what there is to know. I mean, you talked about China, which is going to be absolutely essential that they decarbonise rapidly. Currently, they have a 2060 net zero target.
Is that right?
Yeah, which first of all, it's far too long in the future, because as the IPCC have rightly or wrongly indicated, we need to halve our global emissions by 2030. So if China's still pumping out, billions of tons of carbon a year, that might undermine those goals. But the same is true, obviously, of the EU and Russia and the United States and so on. China's not uniquely bad. It's just it as a country produces a disproportionate share of emissions. So its 2060 target is too late in the future, as are all of the 2050 targets of other nations. The other thing to say is that net zero is a very misleading term. What it means is that if you emit a certain amount of carbon, you have to remove a certain amount of carbon at the same time. There's lots of ways of doing this. I mean, we hear a lot of talk nowadays about carbon capture and storage, which is this idea that you plant a bunch of vegetation, plants, trees, to suck carbon out, and then you burn them in a power station, and you bury the carbon underground, basically. So the idea is you've sucked it in, you've generated your energy, but you haven't put any carbon back into the atmosphere. So there's all sorts of problems with that. Firstly, there's the land area that you need to produce enough vegetation for it to work on scale. One figure I heard, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I heard that you would have to reforest an area the size of India.
I heard that.
Yes.
Yeah.
In order to achieve that. So maybe that's not viable. There's also talks of direct air capture, which is basically building these big machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Again, there's a huge amount of steel and concrete is needed, so there's a big upfront carbon cost to producing these things, and they haven't been tested at scale. There's only been little projects here and there. So the fact that we may be relying on ideas like this in order to make ends meet in carbon terms is quite troubling.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other curious initiatives which I've heard about. Like there's a company called Blue Planet. I think it's based in Iceland. No, there's two companies. There's Climeworks and Blue Planet, who are doing interesting work. Like one of them, I can't remember which, has figured out a way to turn carbon from the atmosphere into artificial limestone, which could potentially be used in building projects. I hear. I don't know whether that's true or not. But how did we get to this? Sorry, I've gone off on a slight tangent.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably because my question was very vague. It was just kind of did you have any thoughts or assessment of the geopolitical situation
Right. I was talking.
Climate?
So I was talking about net zero. Is that how it is? Okay. So the problem with net zero is that it doesn't mean real zero. You can still have billions of tons being released in a net zero scenario. It's just that countries will say that it's net zero because they've planted some trees in Indonesia or South America in order to suck that carbon out. But that's got all sorts of problems.
Someone else might cut them down.
Someone might cut them down. Exactly. I mean, how can you reasonably assess that the amount of carbon you've emitted has been removed by the trees? It also gives you a social license to release that carbon in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of problems with the idea of net zero.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, no, I agree with you.
So it's not looking good, unfortunately, is my conclusion, but that's no reason to despair.
No, great. So, yeah, as regards Extinction Rebellion, so let's say you decided to, after you graduate, forget about a job and be a full-time activist.
Yeah.
Would that be solely with Extinction Rebellion, or are there any other groups you're interested in? And if you do want to stick with Extinction Rebellion, do you have your own views on what path you would take within the movement?
So I wouldn't sound particularly attached to one group or another. I would say that the climate issue is the one that I'm most interested in.
Yeah.
Now, that's not necessarily a rational judgment. I mean, it's certainly an issue that needs to be solved, but it's not necessarily the only issue that is existential in nature. So, for instance, I'm reading a book at the moment called The People's Republic of Walmart, which is about how Walmart can be seen as a socialist institution from a certain angle. It's a fascinating book.
All right.
But in an interview that they gave about the book, one of the authors mentioned that he lamented the fact that there isn't a left-wing movement for antibiotic resistance in the way that there is for the climate movement, because if antibiotic resistance doesn't work out, if the situation goes wrong, if antibiotic resistance becomes a widespread problem, it could take medical care back to the Victorian times, basically, because we're heavily dependent on antibiotics. So there's all sorts of issues that you can focus on, but I'm sticking to the climate one, partly because it's an issue that I've known about for many years, and it's one that I sort of know I have a broad grounding in. Will I stay with Extinction Rebellion? I mean, I've come with them, a decent length of the time that they've been around, so I definitely wouldn't leave the movement in a hurry. I have to say, and this would probably make me unpopular with members of the group, I do think the movement has some problems.
Yeah.
So, for instance, one of them is that identity politics is the wrong word, but it does focus a lot on issues relating to sort of race and the fact that it wants to be as inclusive as possible. It wants to include all the views that it can, and in many ways that's a great thing. It's certainly true that I, as a young white person, don't have to worry in the same way that a young black person would getting arrested, for example. I don't face institutional racism in the crime system, for example. And it's important that people are aware of that. But at the same time, if you get too caught up on issues like that, the problem is that it takes up a lot of your time, takes up a lot of your energy. People who just want to join the movement and just get a job done, they become sort of alienated by that. And there's also issues like, how, what's the term I'm looking for? Like people who are not necessarily aware that, you don't use that language, or you need to be careful with which gender pronoun you use.
Yeah.
All of that can be, rightly or wrongly, can be alienating to a lot of people. So I think there was an opening within the activist movement, the climate activist movement, for a group that kind of sets those differences aside, and you just go out there, get the job done. It's not necessarily a way of life. You're not kind of fixated on you accept that you may make mistakes, but broadly speaking, you're just there to do the job, rather than to worry about whether we are completely woke, as it were. I hate to use that term, but I can't think of a better word. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say to that. So what do you think is wrong with XR? I'm interested.
Well, that's interesting what you said about the wokeness and everything, because I don't really know. I haven't thought about it enough to know where completely I stand on all of that. But I do think it is important to respect gender pronouns and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I understand that some of that language has originated in liberal elites contexts, universities, and I do know that it is quite alienating to the local farmer that is my neighbour in the village where I live or whatever. They're not going to understand gender pronouns and everything. Perhaps they need to be educated, but yeah, there is a potential issue there, and it can be possibly partly seen as a working class, middle class division. But now you do have XR working class now, and explicitly a working class group within XR. So it's interesting seeing how there are different. And as for the focus on what you call identity politics and race, I think racial justice is extremely important. Awareness of institutional racism. I'm really pleased that XR International Solidarity Network exists, which is peopled largely by non-white people. Solidarity with Global South movements, I think, is extremely important. But at the same time, I understand what you're saying, that if XR tries to solve too much, especially if it's by talking and not by doing, then we're potentially losing a lot of precious time. So yeah. I haven't fully made up my mind on practically the way forward around those issues, but my criticism is more about basic strategy. So like Roger Hallam, I think, he's a really nice guy. I've spent time with him. I did a hunger strike with him before. I didn't do very
Amazing. I bow down to you.
I didn't go very long. I just did like 4 days, and
only 4 days.
He and the other guys did like 12, 13 days. It was Vote No Heathrow campaign for the Heathrow expansion, and on a personal level, I really enjoyed spending time with the guy. But I can understand why people have gotten so upset with him, and I've gotten upset with him at times. Sorry, Roger, if you ever watch this, which might be unlikely, but it might not be. And I think the problem comes when. So this is part of my critique, is that certain individuals, not just Roger Hallam, certain individuals within XR still get, I think, a little bit too much focus. And it's great that these people started the movement, or that they've been influential people within the movement, but the decentralisation hasn't quite worked out properly yet. And that's partly because it's the media, and we've got very strong media in this country, and the media always look for leaders and go back to the same people. And I think journalists, some of them quite lazy, so they just go back to the same people and interview the same people, and they want to fill their auditorium, so they invite the most well-known speakers, and so on and so on. So my critique is partly the lack of decentralisation, despite a lot of lip service to decentralisation. And my other main critique, probably, I think I've got a few, is that yes, Roger Hallam is good at strategy, and he's studied it at PhD level and so on, but he's not the only voice on strategy, and his voice, I think, has been taken to narrowly, or his view has been taken too literally without considering enough other strategic perspectives. And I think we really need more strategic literacy in the movement. We need to actually have strategy workshops where people are taught to think strategically. At the moment in XR, you have other trainings where you're taught to do things creatively, but when it comes to strategy, you're just taught, this is the strategy, we're trying to get so many people arrested to overwhelm the jails, whatever, and you're not really taught to question that very much. It started to change. The most recent strategy was formed by a UK Strategy Assembly, you may know, and the Strategy Assembly consulted lots of different groups, and I think that is going in the right direction. But just breezing through the strategy document they came up with, there is lots that's good in it, but still I feel it doesn't go deeply into the real strategic alternatives, which anyone could gain just by reading a broad selection of literature on activism, even just by reading the recommended texts. If you go through some of the XR resources, so there's a book, This is an Uprising, by the Anglers. There's Why Civil Resistance Works, Chenoweth, which Roger Hallam quotes from a lot, but a lot of people haven't read. I would really encourage people to read these texts, which the founding members of XR base a lot of their theory on, because you can read them in different ways, and I think the way that they're applied at the moment has still been quite narrow. And yeah, like how or why civil resistance, I always get confused with it, it's how or why civil resistance works, Chenoweth and Stefan. That book, about the success of various social movements over the years and focusing on non-violent ones being more successful than violent ones and what have you, that's all well and good, but we have to look at the strategic situation. I'm not suggesting using violence, but I'm just saying the way that those movements succeeded, we have to look at different options, because we're not just looking for regime change in the way that most of those movements were toppling dictators and so on. Where, you know, our dictator is the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, and possibly even the whole economic system underlying it. So that's not the same thing as getting rid of Slobodan Milosevic or Vladimir Putin or whoever it is. So I think a broader concept of strategy and more strategic literacy and autonomy in local groups, but still coordinated, is what I would like to see. And possibly more, people are starting to talk about it more, but movement, building with other movements, but on a strategic level, not just let's all meet and go out on the same march, but actually looking in fine detail at the different strategies of different groups and trying to write a coherent strategy for all the groups together. But that's much easier said than done. Sorry, that was a really long answer to your
I'm going to have to rewatch this and go through that piece by piece, because there's a lot that I could say.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Have you got any immediate response to that, or just part of it? Or?
So my completely off the head, probably incoherent response is I think there is a desperate need at this stage to not overcomplicate things.
Okay.
So you do have to take your prompts from the literature, as it were, whether it's Chenoweth or the Anglers or whatever it may be. You do have to have some kind of factual historical basis for the strategy that you choose.
Yeah.
But I think what stimulates people is just action.
Yeah.
You know, it's action that mobilises people. There's a very great quote that I can't remember, but something like, action creates movements, not the other way around, I think is the quote I'm thinking of. So, you know, if I would tentatively say, if I were to start up my own movement, I would have it as a kind of no frills approach, in the sense that, you know, you get people who are interested in a room, even if it's just a few of you. You go out, you do something that's materially disruptive.
Yeah.
Okay, and off the back of that, you either take off or you don't. You know, but it is. I do believe strongly that it is action that people are attracted to, rather than carefully thought out strategic analysis. As long as you stick to principle, as you say, like non-violence, that's something that I'm religiously against. Yeah. Like, I think if you don't draw the line at violence, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
Then I would tentatively say the approach you take is actually less important. That comes later.
Yeah.
Like, you see, do first, reason later. Would be my tentative answer.
Okay.
But I could be completely wrong about that as well. So. Yeah.
No, part of it's interesting because it's so complex. Part of me does resonate with that approach.
Yeah.
And to an extent, once you've got a few key things straight in your head, then I think then just go out and act. Part of me agrees with that, but I think it only goes so far. Yeah, I think maybe this point could be continued another time because I would need to think about it some more. But like, you know, my sort of riposte might be that hasn't worked with Extinction Rebellion, but then you might come back at me and say, well, that's because Extinction Rebellion hasn't been spontaneous enough and people are strategizing too much.
Broadly, I would agree with that. Yes.
Okay.
There was a wonderful time during the April Rebellion where everything was taking off. It's like, oh my God, this is actually happening. You know, we've actually brought 4 major London spots to a standstill. We're in the media. Everyone's talking about climate change. But then between that and the October Rebellion, there was this big kind of, for me at least, this big kind of languishing period where a lot of momentum was wasted. I mean, there was stuff going on, but if it would have been, okay, let's just wait 2 weeks and do it again, you know, because we've got all this attention. Like, why didn't we do that? You know, and now I'm sure someone like Roger Hallam could come up with an answer to that. But yeah, I think there was a lot of momentum which was wasted. I think.
Well, I mean, I can tell you what I've learnt about that situation, which I'm sure isn't the whole story, is that what happened after the initial fairly successful actions of the bridge blocks is that there was suddenly a lot of people liking on Facebook and all the rest of it, and the movement didn't have, or the organisation as it was, or as you could still call it, I'm not sure, didn't have the capacity to take on all of these new recruits, and I think there was too much sort of anxiety, if you like, about how are we going to keep all these new people, and we've got to train them all and everything. Whereas, like you say, if it had been more like, okay, we know lots of people have liked the Facebook group, let's do a call out for another big action straight away, instead of worrying about keeping them and stamping XR on everyone. It's
true, and a lot of it is extremely well intentioned, to be clear. Like, I did many workshops after the April Rebellion, like, you know, learning how to witness an arrest properly and learning what a police liaison officer does, and you know, all these things which you should know going into an action. But keep in mind, I went into the April Rebellion, basically with almost none of that. You know, I'd been to, I think, one major XR meeting before that, just a few weeks prior, which was basically an introduction to the group, a bit of a local gathering, basically, and some ideas were bounced around. But I was there largely spontaneously, and like you can always ask someone who knows what they're doing on the day.
On that level, I totally agree with you. So when I talk about strategy, I'm not talking about making sure that every group has all exactly the right kit to take with them to actions and all. I mean, you know, people care and everything's really important, regenerative culture and all the rest of it. But yeah, I definitely think there's more scope for people who don't want to bother with all of that and don't even want to bother with police liaisons if they don't have to, or even legal observers if they don't have to.
As long as people are aware of the risks that they face by doing this. As long as it's clear, you could be arrested, you could face this. You know, if you take care of children for a living, you could lose the right to do that. As long as you're aware of that, just go. That's what I'd say.
Definitely. No, I'm well up for more of that. But I guess, where I was coming from was more target selection, stuff like that. Like more, there's more maybe thinking could be done on where are the best places to target. And at what times and all that kind of strategy.
That's the big question that I have actually. It's like, where do we go next? You know, do we do a repeat of April, which was our biggest success as a movement, or do we focus now to more specific targets? You know, more bank occupations, more you know, Occupy Whitehall, something like that.
Because I'm still slightly confused about the so-called mainstream strategic view within XR, which is, I know, still very much dominated by Roger Hallam's sort of perspective, which is that. Which is still purportedly, I think that we should be focusing on blocking the government, as it were, or forcing the government through the police to give in to demands. And yet this does seem to be more targeting of banks and stuff now, which in the beginning Roger Hallamore said, oh no, you shouldn't do that, you should just focus on the government. But I think it is worth focusing on these big corporations, because with, you know, there's no situation like the climate in Chenoweth's research and so on. So yeah, what is the balance between focusing on corporations and government? I'm not sure, but yeah, I think like blocking up the halls of power, actually going into Parliament more, okay, it's probably more of a risk in terms of jail time and stuff, but I'm not sure so much about disrupting the public anymore personally.
Would that will make people less sympathetic to
yeah,
the cause?
Possibly. Yeah. I'm not sure what to ask you at this point. I mean, have you got any more thoughts on strategy, or?
No, I should say full disclosure. This isn't something that I've studied in great depth.
Yeah.
As I say, you know, Extinction Rebellion was my first time as an activist,
Yeah.
and there's a huge amount that I've come across just from that.
Yeah.
But I haven't done what someone like Roger Hallam done, which is sit down, you know, year after year and
Yeah.
put this
Well,
all
neither
into.
have I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of what I'm saying is conjecture, really. You know,
Yeah,
I could be completely wrong, and I don't want to shy away from that. Yeah, in terms of strategy, as I say, my tentative approach would be the simpler the better, as long as people are clued up on the essentials.
Yeah.
You know, the consequence of arrest. You know, going into this action, what could you be charged for? You know, things like that are very, very important. But you can't let the energy be drained by being too theoretical, too proper in your outlook.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I think it might be nice to leave it there,
Sure,
Edred. That's
no
a
problem.
nice length of time.
No problem. Yeah, we're nearly out of the pandemic, but I still do this all the time. Yes,
Fantastic.
yeah.
All right, cool. I'm not sure I've ever done that before, actually.
Have you not? Have you not?
Yeah. So yeah, perhaps we'll have another chat another time. See where you are at, maybe in a few months or something.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
I'll be in Exeter for at least the next 2 years. So
Oh,
yes,
okay.
I'm sure there'll be an opportunity.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Nice one. Okay.
Peace out.